It's actually surprisingly hard to make a good wargames hill, and in this episode, we're going to see if we can figure this out once and for all. I recently attended the Square-Based Open, a large Warhammer event in Toronto organized by my friend Val from the Square-Based podcast. In the lead up to the event, when Val asked me for some advice on how to build hills to put on the tables, I decided to help. Making good wargaming hills is one of the oldest challenges for hobbyists because almost more than any other project, they highlight the limitations of crafting in miniature. There are several considerations that need to be balanced to make a good wargaming hill, and they seem to work against each other. Balancing realism and playability are important for any terrain project, and wargaming hills seem to embody this problem more than anything else. For one, the hill needs to be playable, meaning it needs to fulfill its role in the game. Miniatures have to be able to stand on it, and, here's the kicker, not tip over. Now, if you're playing a skirmish game or a game that uses loose formations like Warhammer 40k, this isn't such a problem. It's not too hard to find areas for a few models to stand on a piece of terrain, provided there are some reasonably flat areas. But with a rank and flank game like Warhammer the Old World, where your troops are arrayed in tight block formations, things get a little bit more complicated, especially when balanced against the second consideration, which is making it look like an actual hill. If you look at wargaming hills over the years, you'll see what I call the traditional wargaming hill. These are the ones they used to teach you how to make in old Warhammer books like this one. There are certainly some upsides to this type of hill. First of all, they're perfectly flat on top, so if your minis are up there, they're not going to be tipping over. That's good. But on the other hand, there are two huge disadvantages to this type of hill. First of all, if you're only partially on the hill, you either have to prop up one side of your unit's base, or you're going to be tipped on an angle that's unsustainable, and you get stuff like this happening. This jeopardizes your careful paint jobs and can really slow down the game. But secondly, and perhaps a bigger problem, is these look nothing like real hills. Real hills are sloped gradually, their sides becoming rounded with the eons of weathering processes that created them. Nowhere are you going to find these flat areas with steep sides like the traditional wargaming hill. Why are you laughing? That doesn't count. That doesn't count. Okay, these are called terraces. These are man-made features for farming in areas that are too hilly to farm normally, and you aren't going to see something like this on a flat field. That's a whole different thing. Ignore that. Now you might be thinking, well, if you're playing on a flat tabletop, there's going to be no such thing as a realistic hill anyways, because hills generally don't just pop out of a flat field. Hills are usually found in hilly areas, or not at all, you might say. Well, let me draw your attention to something called a drumlin.
Behind me, you'll see a drumlin.
Behind me is a drumlin.
Go to a conference and have people talking about drumlins. I think of this drumlin, this big drumlin.
Drumlins are a type of hill caused by glaciation that does in fact rise out of a flat plain. So clearly, in theory, we can get a nice gradually rising hill coming out of a flat area. Let's make some. So, we're going to make some nice gradually sloping hills. But how steep should the slope be? Here's an example of a 30-degree slope, which I think you can tell is a little bit too steep. If you put a mini on it, it might keep its footing, but it also might slide off or tip over. In real life, a 30-degree slope is a pretty steep hill too. I found this clip of a guy going down a 30-degree slope, and as you can see, it's hard to keep your footing. Let's try half of that, a 15-degree slope. This is still about double the maximum steepness that they go by when building roads, but it's much more manageable at a miniature scale. You can see the miniature sits nicely on the slope and doesn't have the urge to slide or fall over. Nice. So with those tests done, let's get to work on our hills. I start with some 1/2-inch extruded polystyrene insulation foam, drawing some chicken nugget-like shapes directly onto the foam with a dry erase marker. With a sharp knife, I cut those shapes into just the right size, and I make a few larger ones with a higher area by adding a smaller second layer of foam. So there's another practicality concern to consider here. A piece of tabletop terrain needs to be durable. As a hill with a gradual slope gets thinner, that thin bit towards the edge becomes increasingly fragile. So we're going to need a substrate to put these hills on that'll be durable and also lie perfectly flat. The best material that I can think of is styrene sheet, also known as plasticard. Now, Plasticard is sold in hobby stores in small sheets and it's pretty expensive. But if you're a hardcore crafter like me, you can find a plastic supplier near you who will sell you a huge sheet for way cheaper. I ended up buying what's pretty much a lifetime supply of Plasticard in 3 different thicknesses in some giant sheets. All of a sudden, this is a practical and cost-effective solution. So with my foam hill blanks cut out, I traced my foam shapes onto the Plasticard, then cut out the Plasticard with a pair of kitchen shears. Next, I glue the foam down onto the Plasticard bases with some construction adhesive, squishing them down to make sure that there's a snug fit. With the glue dry, I use a knife or foam cutter to cut the rough slope of the hills. Because of the Plasticard base, I'm able to get the edges of the hills really thin. Hell yeah. Next, I take these bad boys out into the driveway, because this next step is pretty messy. I use a palm sander to smooth down the edges of the hill and make it a nice smooth and gradual slope. This could easily be done by hand with a sanding block, but I'm making a whole tournament's worth of hills here. I think something like 20 hills. So the power sander will save a lot of time. I made a nice variety of different hill shapes, some of which had a bit of exposed rock and with a variety of slopes and shapes, but they're all still roughly the same size. Some of them have a very low and subtle profile, others have a little bit more going on. I brought those back inside and laid down some plastic sheeting, then mixed up a mixture of 2 tubes of caulking, 2 cups of sand, a half cup of grout, 1 cup of house paint, and about a half a cup of isopropyl alcohol just to thin the mixture. I've made a similar mixture for many projects before on this channel, but this is the first time that I've measured the ingredients, and this ratio turned out to be pretty good. So for everyone who's been requesting measurements, ask and you shall receive. Using a large paintbrush, I generously coat all the hills with this mud mixture, trying not to leave obvious brush strokes and making sure to get a nice solid coverage. Nice. Alright, so I've got some of the mud mixture on my hills here, and while it's still wet, I'm going to apply some flocks and static grasses. But first, let's take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Baron of Dice. Baron of Dice makes premium wargaming dice, hand-poured in resin and laser engraved with cool symbols to complement your tastes perfectly. They sent me some to try out, and I asked for some with these gear and skull dice, which I thought would go really nicely with my Mechanicum army. And yeah, these are dead on. They look wicked. I particularly like the matte finish on these things because they feel really nice in my hand and are just fun to roll. Baron of Dice has a great selection of different designs and colors to choose from, so you can definitely find something to complement your army. They also offer all kinds of sets of RPG dice, which I like to use to count wounds on my big monsters and things. So check out Baron of Dice for some premium dice for your games. Right now they have their naughty list, which is an automatic discount of 25% on hundreds of items. Follow the link in my description to get yours now. Thanks Baron of Dice for sponsoring this video. Using a shaker bottle, I apply a patchy coverage of flock all over my hills, letting the flock stick to the wet mud mixture underneath. Immediately after this, I come back in with some static grass, sprinkling a generous coat over the remaining areas. Because of the mud mixture below, any areas of sparse coverage or exposed dirt will end up looking pretty natural. I was pretty happy with this look after the first coat, but the flock and static grass can still be rubbed off with a finger at this stage. It's all pretty fragile. So I applied some matte scenic sealant to everything, soaking the hills generously. This should create a much stronger adhesion and add a protective coating to the outside as well. Hell yeah. So with everything dry, you can see that the ground cover is now very durable. I can scuff at it pretty hard with a finger and it's not going anywhere. This is exactly what I want for some terrain that's going to get some heavy use like this. So, Val lent me some examples of the mats that he was going to be using at the tournament, and I decided to try to make the hills match them as best I could. Right, so as you can see, it looks alright. It's decently matching actually, but it's not perfect. I think we can get a little bit closer, and I think it'll improve the look of these as well. If you see, this mat has these yellowy, bright highlights. I think I can bring some of that out on here as well. One way to do that would be to use a brighter yellow or static grass, but I might just squirt it with the airbrush and see what happens there. Another issue that you can see here is the edges are chipping a little bit right where the Plasticard meets that mixture of ground texture. And the upshot is there's a little bit of white sticking out. I really hope to avoid something like that.
And you know, in the planning stages, I was thinking I should probably prime and varnish and paint brown this edge before I put the mix on, because the mix is going to chip. And this is just a result of me not listening to myself, not taking my own advice, not following my own gut. But what are you going to do?
This mat that has partial snow cover, for example, also features some gray stone areas. To match that, I'll paint the exposed stone areas on this hill here gray to tie them in a little bit more with the board. To match that snow cover, I'll mix some snow flock together with some matte Mod Podge into a sort of paste and apply that in random splotches all over the hill. For another mat that had more complete snow cover, I skipped the mud mixture and flock step altogether. Instead, I underpainted the hill with some light grey and some blue paint, then added some splotches of dark grey to indicate exposed rock. With that done, I covered the whole hill with the same snow mixture as before. This ended up looking pretty cool, I think. And that was it. This is how you can get some good looking naturalistic hills with a nice gradual slope that troops can go up and down without any problem at all. I think with this design, I've found the sweet spot between aesthetically pleasing and playable. And that's exactly what I was trying to do. So I can call this one a success. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I enjoyed making it. A huge thank you to all my patrons and your continued support for the channel. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop. And thanks again to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this video. Use the link in the description below to get some premium dice for your games.